but it's fine.
So you're in a few of the pictures, so is Tom.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, she didn't ask me about my face going up there.
We'll replace it with a bottle of sun drop. It's okay. Same thing.
Yeah.
Nobody has questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the review. I feel like I'm coming in really loud. I think I heard myself echo there. So the exam is going to be formatted exactly like your first exam. There are fewer fill in the blank because I didn't really like those. And the ones that I have will kind of have a hint. So like maybe 2 words for you to choose from to kind of fill in the sentence. But other than that, pretty much the same format. Multiple choice, there's 1 matching, some true false, and then some short answer. So that's as far as the format. It's about the same number of questions too. This time I did include 3 extra credit questions as well to hopefully give you some extra points if you really study the information. So does anybody have questions on the format before I get into the review? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the first lecture that we did, which is the cattle lecture.
Blessings.
You sit there talking and you sit there agreeing.
Mine is stopped though. Oh, when do we get the grades back on that assignment?
What assignment?
Oh, it's not due till Wednesday anyway.
Exactly.
What is that?
The livestock.
Yeah, it's not due until Wednesday, so it's not. I've graded the ones that you've done, so those, but it may be set to not release your grade till everyone's done. Can y'all see this?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm probably going to ask after every slide presentation just to make sure that I have it pulled up before I start talking. Okay, so just to kind of review a little bit about cattle and kind of what I think is important. So they're the most important livestock species in terms of value and weight of their products. But what's really important is that ruminants consume fibrous plants that can't be digested by non-ruminants. So that's something that's really important about ruminants. That's kind of key. Another thing is that we went over the 2 different species of cattle, so the Bos taurus and the Bos indicus, and we talked a little bit about the differences between those. So that would be something that would be good for you to know. Why, maybe just like 1 or 2 characteristics of how they would be something you'd want to be familiar with. So like Bos indicus are better in kind of more tropical climates. They're very heat resistant and parasite resistant, but they don't have as good meat quality as some of the Bos taurus breeds. So know the differences between those 2 and be able to—
I have a question.
Yes.
About the Bos indicus. What exactly is up with the hump on its back and that gizzard-looking thing hanging down between its forelegs?
So the gizzard-looking, you're talking about hanging down from its neck?
Mm-hmm.
That I'm actually not really sure. The hump, I would say, is probably kind of similar to like camels, where they kind of store some fat that can be broken down for water. And because they can live in kind of drier climate, they are more resistant to heat. So it would be something kind of like that, where they can store that fat, and then when if there's a drought or something like that, or if it gets too hot, their body can break that down for water.
Which I would guess that around the neck and all is probably for heat dissipation too, increase in surface area. That's my guess.
Yeah, that could be it. Yeah, I have no idea about all of the neck. It seems like that would kind of just get in the way, but
Yes.
okay, so yeah, know some key differences between those 2 breeds. I'm not going to ask you anything about domestication for any of the PowerPoints that we talked about this time, because we covered a lot of that last time on the first test, and some of the actual key concepts that I think are more important. So don't worry about domestication and the scientific names of the animals and things like that. You're not going to need to know, external anatomy. For genetics, you might want to know things like, improvements of cattle genetics have led to, what? So increased milk and meat production, milk composition, better quality. And those are kind of things that go along with any other species. It's important to know what sire selection is based on, that it's primarily based on genetics and the heritability of traits. That's something that's pretty key. Stress, you might want to know like which management techniques might cause a stress response in cattle. So just be familiar with those. As far as reproduction and primary goals of different production systems, something that I'd really like you to understand would be the difference in the primary goals between dairy production and beef production. So they don't have the same primary goals. Dairy production wants high milk production and then producing replacement heifers. And beef production, you really want that meat. And you're kind of looking at milk production, but it's mainly for meat. So know the difference between those. I'm not going to ask you numbers this time as far as the gestation lengths of the animals, so you don't need to know specific numbers as far as that goes. So, and this is true for every livestock species that we've talked about. So I'm going to kind of expect you to be familiar with terms that classify animals reproductively, like polyestrous or seasonally polyestrous, those kinds of terms, and then also nutritionally, which we'll get to in a second. So I'll expect you to know ruminant versus non-ruminant. So cattle are polyestrous, and that means that they cycle throughout the year. I feel like we've talked about that enough now. You should be pretty familiar with that term. And again, I'm not going to ask you any of these specific numbers. So a little bit about heat detection. You can maybe kind of know maybe a little bit about what happens and how you might know that a cow is in heat. Definitely focus on the AM/PM rule as well. I think I kind of mentioned that in the last class period. It's in bold and underlined, so that's kind of my telltale. That's probably going to be on the test. So be familiar with that cattle should be inseminated during the last half of standing heat, about 12 hours after the onset of heat, and then that's pretty easy to explain at AM, PM. Be familiar with that and what it's used for. So as far as cattle reproduction, kind of a little bit more about it. Again, there's two terms on this slide, bolded and underlined, so those are probably going to show up. Dystocia just means difficulty calving, so it's just a term that even in this period of the animal science in my life, I still kind of run into, so it's a good term to know. Colostrum is also a really, really important one to know, and that's because it's the first milk, like we talked about, that animals need to get because it contains the antibodies to protect the newborn from disease. So that's how they get their passive immunity, kind of cover them until they can develop their own immunity. So colostrum is extremely important in livestock production. So make sure that you're familiar with those too. So as far as the ruminant digestive system, like I said, know the classification of different livestock species, whether they're monogastrics or ruminants, or we did talk about one kind of modified ruminant. So as far as the compartments of the ruminant stomach, be familiar with these four and know, the main thing that they do. So I'm not going to have a picture and ask you to identify which one it is, but just know the primary function of each part. So the rumen is mainly microbial digestion or fermentation. So that's mainly what's going on there. It's producing volatile fatty acids, but mainly microbial digestion and fermentation is its primary function. And then the reticulum is connected to the rumen, and that's where heavy or dense feed will actually fall into that compartment, and then it can kind of go between the reticulum and the rumen. So be familiar with that. The omasum, the primary function of the omasum is the absorption of liquids. So we talked about how the omasum is really important in calves because they're drinking a liquid diet. So the omasum is mainly liquid absorption. And then the abomasum is what's called the true stomach. So it's similar to the stomach that we have. And the primary function would be chemical digestion. So definitely know like those key things about each of those compartments. And that will help you a lot. So feeds must meet nutritional requirements, obviously. The nutrients required are the same for all livestock species. So not too many specifics on this slide. I'm not going to really ask you too much about I'm not going to ask you anything about the numbers, like how much, gross receipts have been or anything like that. So I wouldn't worry too much about this slide. And a key thing you might want to know about the different types of production is whether the number of operations is increasing or decreasing. And the number of animals. So the trend that we've talked about with a lot of the production systems is that the number of farms is decreasing, but the number of animals on those farms is increasing. So that's just kind of a general trend, general thing to be familiar with, but I'm not going to ask you any numbers. I would expect you to be pretty familiar with this slide as it's one of the major diseases in cattle, and mad cow disease is a huge deal. Not as big of a deal these days because we have ways to control it, but it is important to know about it because it is something that can be very devastating to the industry. So definitely be familiar with this slide. Yeah, is there a question?
Are we going to need to remember it by the acronym, the full thing, or just mad cow disease?
So if you see the full name, the acronym will be there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, because it's hard to remember the full name. It's a very scientific-y name, so most people just call it BSE. So if you see the full name, the BSE will be there to kind of trigger your memory. But yeah, basically it's mad cow.
All right.
So the segments of beef production, again, I'm not going to ask you, how many cows are there per farm. I'm not going to ask you too many specifics about the different types of beef production because those can kind of vary a little bit depending on, what country you're in and things like that. So I'm not going to get too heavy into that. Again, like I said, something that I would like you to know is that the number of beef operations is decreasing. So you have more large producers. So as far as the selection of beef animals, it's important to know the production traits that you're selecting for. So growth and feed efficiency are big ones for pretty much any species. And then for beef and pork, well, really, and chickens too, carcass quality is a big thing. So you want to keep performance records, and then conformation can tell you a little bit about meat yield based on the skeleton and muscle. So body condition score, I'm not going to ask you numbers specifically, but one key thing that I would like you to focus on is why is it important? So it's important for nutritional management, and it's also linked to reproductive performance. So those are two key things that are what make body condition score really, really useful. And that's why producers need to pay attention to the condition of their animals. So really know why that is needed. So as far as the beef breeds, we talked about British versus continental. So instead of really asking you to remember like everything about an Angus or everything about a Charolais, just a kind of general type thing, be familiar with the British breeds versus the continental breeds and a few key differences between those two types. So the British breeds are smaller, so they reach mature size at an earlier age. They have less growth potential, but they have great fertility and calving ease. You're not going to need to list all of those, but be familiar with a few of the differences. That way on the question, you could give me a few of the differences between the British breeds and the continental breeds. Now, one key thing to understand is that in the beginning of the lecture, we talked about the two different species of cattle. So Bos taurus and Bos indicus are the species of cattle. And then the British versus continental are the different breeds. Is everybody clear on that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So that's something that's really key to know. So again, I'm not going to ask you, which breeds fall into which category, just kind of key, general, how do the British compare to the continental breeds type of thing. So I'm not going to ask you specifics really about each breed. Again, I'm not going to really ask you about the history or the domestication because I think kind of focusing more on the production side is a little bit more important because we did cover some of the domestication already. I'm not going to specifically ask you again about breeds of dairy cattle or anything like that. So again, you might want to know that milk production is increasing. Just kind of a key thing, not going to ask you numbers. So dairy management requires a lot of money, and they need double the amount per cow compared to beef. And then producers have to follow a lot of regulatory programs. Something to decide, nothing too majorly important on the slide that I'm going to ask. So record systems are really critical. And sire selection sources could be artificial insemination, herd sires or herd sires. But one really key thing with sire selection that I really want you to know is what we talked about earlier with they're selected based on genetics and heritability of traits. It's kind of really what I want you to know about that. I'm not going to really ask you top states this time. So for dairy nutrition, energy and protein requirements must be met. And then in early lactation, the amount of high moisture is reduced as the volume of intake is limited. So what's really key on this slide, though, is that it is extremely hard to meet nutritional requirements during lactation. And that is because lots of energy is being used for milk production. And so the cow has to take energy from her body and put it towards milk production. And so she's almost in a constant state of negative energy balance because it is so hard to meet that nutritional requirement. So know that stage of production is lactation when that happens, when it's really hard to meet the requirements of a dairy cow. I will expect you to know what a TMR, total mixed ration, is because we talked about this and Ken told it, it's a pretty big hint. So it basically combines forages, grains, proteins, minerals, vitamins, and additives that are formulated to a specific concentration of nutrients into a single mix. So really know that that's what that is and know that it's fed to dairy cattle mainly. You could feed it to other animals if you wanted to, other ruminants. But typically we see it fed to dairy cattle. So be familiar with what that is. So in dairy reproduction, like we talked about, the cow is the primary focus. So you want to make sure that you're managing both of the animals well. Assisted reproductive technology, we have AI and things like that we talked about. I'm not going to really ask about embryo transfers or in vitro fertilization because we didn't really go into that. So mainly AI would be something that you would focus on there. For dairy cattle reproduction, also we talked about mastitis and infections with the mammary gland. So mastitis is persistent inflammatory reaction of the udder tissue to an infection. So that can be really devastating to the dairy industry. So I would expect you to be familiar with that disease in dairy. Not really disease, more infection. So milking is the most important job at a dairy farm. Cows are milked at regular times. That's pretty much about all I'm going to expect you to know from that. So milk quality, important factors with that are herd health, clean animals, clean equipment, cool and store milk. So milk quality determines consumer satisfaction. I'm not going to really ask you too much about the regulatory programs or anything like that. Be familiar with biosecurity. It reduces risk of introducing new pathogens. But again, the key thing with dairy cattle that I'd like you to, the key term I'd really like you to know is mastitis
Look at this.
and what that is. So as far as dairy cow behavior and stress, we kind of talked about, similarly with what we talked about beef cattle, know which things, which management techniques could kind of evoke a stress response. So like tagging or anything like that, putting them in a gate, in a chute, if you're not doing it properly. Just kind of know general things that happen in management that would maybe stress that animal out. And so then in dairy cows, this is a really long list. You don't need to know all of these, but just some things that cause stress in cattle. So dairy cow facilities are designed for comfort and health. Important factors are ventilation, quality, and accessibility of feed, lighting, and cow comfort. So not too many key things from that slide. Manure management is an important part of dairy production, as it is with a lot of livestock production operations. So as far as managing dairy cattle, it varies by the type of cattle that you're using. So we talked about the different kind of stages there. A little bit about pre-weaned calves. Again, the key that I really want you to know is that calves have to get antibodies from colostrum, and that provides them their passive immunity. So colostrum, again, is that first milk from the mom. It's a little bit different from the milk that they're going to produce later on. So make sure that you understand what colostrum is and what it does. So as far as replacement heifers, again, I'm not going to ask you numbers, so you don't need to know how long they're really kept around specifically. Cows are culled if they're less profitable or if they have reproductive failure. So that's kind of obvious. Milk production should be optimized in early lactation. And then again, key thing that I talked about is that cows in early lactation have negative energy balance because they have to mobilize their body reserves to provide energy for milk production. So you can't meet their nutritional requirements through feed intake in lactation. So that's kind of the key concept there. And then body condition score, I'm not going to ask you numbers or anything like that. Just know that it's important for nutritional management and because it can lead to reproductive problems if they're not at the right score. So that's all for the cattle lecture. Does anybody have any questions about that? Nope. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to move. Yeah. Do you have questions?
How do you get a cow to move out of your way?
No?
You tell it to move.
Nice.
She's probably been waiting 10 minutes to tell that.
I feel like she has. I feel like she's just been like sitting there in her seat waiting.
Yes.
Seriously lame joke, but it's worked. Come on.
Did.
Cow didn't move.
Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Good. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about pigs. Not going to ask you about domestication. I feel like we talked so much about domestication. We're kind of moving on from that. So there are a lot of different breeds of pigs. I'm not going to ask you, specifics about each breed or anything like that. So yeah, we talked about the different breeds, Yorkshires and Landrace. So some key things that I will expect, which I've already kind of said, pigs are polyestrous, so be familiar with how they're classified reproductively. You don't need to know numbers as far as gestation length or how many piglets or anything like that. I feel like we all know that pigs have litters and cows typically have one, sometimes two. So main thing is to know that they're polyestrous, so they have multiple cycles a year. So also sows should be inseminated using the AM/PM rule, so 12 hours after standing in heat. And then AI, which I kind of mentioned on the previous one. So know an advantage of artificial insemination. one big advantage is that your semen has been checked for quality. So that's a huge thing. There are other advantages, like you don't need to keep a boar or a bull for cattle. So definitely know why artificial insemination would be helpful, and maybe what are a couple advantages of AI. As far as pig nutrition, this is my specialty and it's very near and dear to my heart. So there will be a couple questions on pig nutrition, just like any other species, but I do love pigs. So know, again, just the general concepts. So they're monogastric, they're not ruminant, they have simple stomach, and they're omnivores. So they can eat meat and plants. So those are just kind of terminology: omnivores, herbivores, monogastric, ruminant, that you should really be familiar with and be able to distinguish those general terms. And people would expect coming out of an intro class that you have a good idea of which species is in which category. So those are really just the general things I want you to understand about the nutrition classification. And then feeds must meet requirements, of course. Their diets are formulated based on stage of production. That's the same for any species that's used for livestock. Again, I'm not going to ask you numbers about body condition score, just know why it's important. So we talked about the different stages of production. So farrowing is when the sow gives birth to the piglets, and then at about 21 days they're weaned. And so then the nursery phase is after they've been weaned and they're kind of kept there for 42 to 56 days. The days, just kind of know the nursery phase is after weaning. And then be really familiar with this slide, because this is something that is pretty key with pig production that you don't really see with like poultry production and anything like that. That with pig production there are a lot of challenges in the nursery phase, because weaning is a very, very stressful event in a pig's life. I would dare say it's the most stressful event. So definitely know that weaning is extremely stressful. And be familiar with like the types of stress that happen at weaning. So why these pigs have trouble once they're weaned off their mom, because they have environmental stress, physiological stress, and social stress. So those are some things in pork production that really influence the rest of that pig's life. So this is a really important slide to be familiar with. So after the nursery phase, then they go to the growing phase and then eventually finishing until they get up to market weight. So the pork industry is experiencing change. Obviously, it's growing. So again, like I said with cattle, you don't need to know numbers, but know that the number of farms has decreased, but the number of pigs per farm has increased. So that's kind of a shift that's happening in the cattle industry as well as the pig industry. So just be familiar with that overall trend. So I'm not going to ask you the top states. I'm not going to ask you to list them. But for pork production, we talked about how most of it is in the Midwest. North Carolina has a lot, but North Carolina's kind of by itself in that category because most of the corn this is called the Corn Belt, is in the Midwest. So that's where most pig production is. So again, you don't need to know states, but maybe be familiar with the fact that pig production is happening in the Midwest because corn is there. So that makes sense. And then I'm not going to really ask you the top production companies. These are kind of the numbers. So pigs are typically in total confinement systems, usually. So it's usually low investment outdoor production, or sorry, that's a type of system, is low investment outdoor production. But I'm not really going to ask you too much about the different systems. Again, not too much about the crossbreeding systems or anything like that. I think that's getting a little bit maybe too detailed for what I want you to know. But just sires are selected for genetics and heritability of traits. And then think about your production goals, and you want to maximize feed efficiency and growth and things like that. So something else I'd like you to know about swine production, and this is true for cattle as well, is that the management of manure produced by swine operations is critical in the swine industry. I know, like, John and I were talking that day about all the problems that happen in North Carolina with lagoons overflowing and things like that. So know that management of manure is extremely important in the swine industry. That's a very key thing. So we talked a little bit about contract production, and that's basically just relationships between the swine producers and then the owners, which would be the companies. So you may have contract growers for Smithfield. It's just kind of a general thing. And then industry future, again, number of farms is decreasing, number of pigs is increasing. Just general stuff there. Any questions on pigs? Any jokes on pigs?
If we all turned to animals, why would a woman pick a pig? Because he'd always bring home the bacon. Well, I mean, in today's
Beat
society, a
stereotyping.
man could pick a pig.
Yes.
If she'd bring home the bacon.
Mhm.
But I was trying to be
Mm-hmm.
more general because it's funny.
Yes, I am.
All right, everybody can see that?
Yes.
All right, so then we talked about sheep and goats. So they are for milk, meat, fiber, and leather. They're produced together. I'm not going to ask you the top producing countries this time because I think there are more important concepts this time that I want to focus on. And sheep production is kind of scattered all over, so I'm not going to ask you really too much about location or anything like that. I'm not going to ask like how many sheep we have because I think numbers kind of get in the way of concepts sometimes unless it's an important number. Again, not going to ask you about domestication because we have like talked about domestication enough. So again, terminology, be familiar with some of the terms that obviously are bolded. And these are just kind of general things that you should know about each species. You know, you want to know if you are talking to somebody who produces these animals that you sound like you know what you're talking about because you're using the right terminology. So just be familiar with those. Sheep are seasonally polyestrous, so they're a little bit different from just polyestrous. Polyestrous is, you know, they have cycles all throughout the year. Seasonally polyestrous is that they have many cycles, but during a certain season. So if you kind of just think about the term and the words, it should be pretty easy to put that definition together. So be familiar with this slide. You don't need to know the numbers again, but know that they're seasonally polyestrous and that they're short day breeders. So opposite to some of the animals we talked about, like horses that are long day breeders, sheep are short day breeders. So they start breeding in the fall when the days are getting shorter, so their lambs are born in the spring. So just kind of a little key thing there about their reproduction. And then their nutritional demands actually increase during late gestation because of fetal growth. And that's kind of true across the board, except with dairy cattle where we talked about their major nutritional increases during lactation. So because sheep were not really being used primarily for milk production, their nutritional demands would increase during late gestation is when they would be at their peak. So for this slide, age of puberty is determined by several factors, and this is true not just for sheep, but also for many different species. So be familiar with a couple of the factors that can determine the age of puberty. So some of them are fairly obvious, like the breed, the body size, genetic selection, nutrition, like that. So just be familiar with a couple of those and be able to maybe tell me a couple of things that determine the age of puberty of an animal. I'm not going to ask you specifics about sheep breeds or anything like that. So another key thing that we talked about that you probably see is that we talked about dual purpose breeds, and so that's basically just breeds that are used for two purposes. It's pretty easy. And then an example of that would be that sheep are used for meat and wool, would just be a good example. So just be familiar with what dual purpose means. Again, bold's an underlined term. Dead giveaway. So mutton is meat from adult sheep. That's what that means. So anything from a sheep that was under a year old is considered lamb, but after that it's considered mutton. So for sheep nutrition, again, it's pretty general. They're ruminants like cattle, and then they have a really, they're very, very sensitive to copper. So either deficiency or toxicity can be a problem. So you don't want too much or too little. So know that copper is the mineral there that they have an issue with, because that is really key for sheep nutrition. As far as sheep management, of course, like with anything, you can vaccinate them, internal parasites, deworming. Not, I wouldn't say completely unique to sheep, but what you typically focus on in sheep is fly strike, which is the maggots that get in the wool because the feces on the tail attracts flies. So be familiar with what fly strike is, and then what is a good management tool to prevent that, and that's just docking the tail. So it's very easy to prevent. It's very simple prevention strategy there. So be familiar with what that is and then how you can prevent it if you were to raise sheep. And we also talked about foot rot. So be familiar with foot rot. You know, what is it? It's a disease, one of the worst diseases in the sheep industry. And then a little bit about how you can prevent it. Basically, vaccinations, good sanitation. Kind of common sense things there. Obviously, if you have a cleaner facility, cleaner area, they're not going to be as susceptible. So just be familiar with what that is. So sheep meat, we kind of talked about mutton is adult sheep meat. And this is kind of, you don't need to know these numbers. Maybe be familiar with some methods that are used to protect sheep. So you can use guard dogs, donkeys, and llamas, or fencing, or killing and trapping predators. Be familiar with some of the different methods that are used there. Wool is just the hair or fur of the sheep and goats, and it's removed by shearing. It's pretty much it. Also, just a side note, I bought a sweater the other day that is actually made from merino wool, and it is amazing. I'm definitely a fan. I had never bought one before. I don't even know how to like take care of it or anything, but it's super soft. So then for this slide, no transgenic animal. And that's, again, a term that people would expect that out of an intro class you'd be familiar with. And it was on the first exam, and I know that people kind of struggled with it, so I wanted to kind of revisit that to make sure that you understand it. So basically, a transgenic animal is one where the gene of another organism has been inserted into the genetic material. So that's the really key about the transgenic animal. So it's different because hybrid vigor is what arises from crossbreeding, like two animals, the traits, and things like that. Transgenic is a gene from another animal has been directly inserted. So it doesn't necessarily mean like full-on crossbreeding. So be familiar with this definition because you will see that on the exam. And then another thing that I think is kind of cool about sheep is that sheep were the first mammals cloned from adult somatic cells. So that's kind of a neat thing to know. So as far as goats, they provide milk, meat, leather, just some products there. Not going to ask you about domestication. Goats are also seasonally polyestrous and short day breeders. So they breed in the fall, so their kids are born in the spring, and kids is the appropriate term there. That's what baby goats are called, which some of you probably knew already. So similar to sheep. So I'm not going to ask you about the different breeds. Goats are ruminants, obviously, like sheep and cattle, so know that they're classified as ruminants. We talked about how their digestive tract is smaller with regard to their energy needs. So a key thing with goats is that they do require a higher quality of diet than cattle. Just because their digestive tract's a little smaller, they don't have as much time to digest the nutrients in the feed, so they do need a higher quality feed. And then another really key thing that also echoes what we talked about with sheep is that their diets contain copper. So you cannot feed goat diets to sheep because you will kill the sheep. So that's a really important thing to know going forward as a difference between sheep and goats. So definitely know everything about the copper toxicity and things like that, and that you cannot feed goat feed to sheep. So goat milk and hair are valuable products from goats. There's an increasing demand for goat meat in the U.S., but I think that's about all I'm going to ask you on goats. Any questions on sheep or goats? Nope. Maybe we'll move. Okay, so after sheep and goats, we talked about buffalo, llamas, and alpacas, and rabbits and deer. So I'm not going to focus as heavily on each of these as I did with like your major livestock species, so like the cattle, the pigs, and then chicken. But there will be a couple questions from this because some of the things are important. So we talked about the American bison or buffalo. I'm not going to ask you numbers. So the terminology is the same as cattle. Nothing really unique there. American bison is well suited to the Great Plains. They can prosper on pastures of native grasses, and they can withstand extreme temperatures better than cattle. They're raised commercially for various markets. So some things we talked about with bison meat and kind of why bison production is important. Their meat is low in fat and high in protein, and it has less calories than chicken or beef and lower cholesterol than beef. So because they are kind of hard to handle and everything like that, you wouldn't really raise them unless there were benefits to their meat. So these are some of the key things at the top of this slide, that their meat is healthier because of those reasons. And so the supply can't fully meet the demand, so the price of bison meat is higher than beef. So that's kind of what drives that price, is because there are not as many bison farms. They're seasonally polyestrous. Again, semen of breeding bulls is tested to ensure fertility. So that kind of goes back to the importance of AI. You know that semen has been checked for quality. So AI is an option, but typically with bison, natural breeding methods are safer because they do have a very unpredictable temperament. And then we talked about for reproduction that young bulls should be brought into the herd every 3 years. And the main reason for this is to prevent inbreeding. So your producer's goals would be to improve performance of the herd by breeding and selecting bigger animals with better feed efficiency that gain weight faster. So those same goals of any production system, really. Unless you're dairy and if you're going for milk production. But yeah, want to prevent inbreeding, so bring new bulls in every 3 years. So of course, keep accurate health and production records, and then these are just all the reasons that animals would be culled. That's pretty easy. So another key thing between bison and cattle is that bison have stronger immune systems than cattle. Because they're a lot hardier, they're a little bit more resistant to parasites and things like that. They do need to be vaccinated similarly to cattle, but they do have stronger immune systems. So that's important difference there. So of course, they're ruminants, also like cattle. They can graze through the winter. So yeah, they might need supplements when their pasture conditions are poor. So you don't need to know how many are in a herd, but again, just know that you need to bring in a new bull every 3 years to prevent inbreeding. And that they're larger, stronger, and more excitable than cattle, so just that they are kind of semi-domesticated. They're not completely domesticated. pretty much same things as far as how much land they need. Need a strong containment system. That's important. I don't think I have any questions about the water buffalo, so we just had that one slide. So then we talked about llamas and alpacas. So llamas are typically used as pack animals, and alpacas are used for fiber. And then llamas are bigger, so that's a good way to distinguish them. Llamas can also be used to protect sheep. So just know a few kind of general things about them that are on the slide. Not going to ask about domestication. And so then again, like we're talking about reproductive and nutritional classifications of the species, llamas and alpacas are induced ovulators. So similar to which animal again?
Cat.
Good job. Okay, so they are induced ovulators, which is kind of different from most of the other big livestock species when you think about it. So definitely know that that's a key thing for them, that they are also induced, meaning that they will ovulate only after they have been bred. So as far as nutrition, they're very similar to ruminants, but their stomach has 3 compartments instead of 4. So you don't need to know what each compartment is or anything like that. Just know that they are kind of considered a modified ruminant because they do have just 3 compartments and they don't have the full 4 that cattle and sheep have. But they're still ruminants. So they're more efficient rough pasture feeders than cattle, sheep, and goats. They can eat forages and browse. They don't really have a lot of disease problems, so not too much to know as far as that goes. They do need to have parasite control, just like any other grazing animal. Rabbits, we talked a little bit about those. So there's different breeds of rabbits, just like with any species. So as far as nutrition, they're herbivores, and they're simple stomached, so monogastric. Remember, monogastric, non-ruminant, and simple stomach all mean the exact same thing. So all of those terms are kind of used interchangeably. So they're monogastrics, and they have a large cecum. So the hind gut is where fermentation occurs. And the other animal that's a hind gut fermenter that we talked about?
Horse.
Horse, yes, exactly. So you wouldn't really think about it by looking at a horse and a rabbit that they have anything in common, but they're both hind gut fermenters when it comes to their nutrition. And so then to more fully utilize plant fiber and nutrients from the feed, rabbits will practice autophagy. And so that term it basically just means that they eat their own feces because they are monogastric, so they don't get as much out of their feed as a ruminant would with the 4 compartments. So a lot of the times, by the time it's gone through one time, there are still nutrients in that feces that are undigested. And so in the wild, it makes sense for them to just turn around and eat it again and give it a second pass and absorb those nutrients and better digest it. So that's what coprophagy means. So be familiar with that term because that's another term that I still encounter occasionally as an animal scientist. So that's pretty much all I asked about rabbits, I think. Rabbits are also induced ovulators. You want to handle them, if they're commercial meat or wool rabbits, you want to handle them as little as possible. And then deer farming, now that I know that deer farming is a thing, just that deer farming actually exists and that it's not huge in the U.S., but it is a type of production system. And the 2 major products are venison and antlers, velvet antler. Any questions about that?
So are we planning a field trip to the buffalo farm in Lunenburg?
No, unfortunately, my great uncle is going to be out of town that day, or he's going to North Carolina for a couple of days, so he's not going to be there. So it did not work out this time. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. So then we have chickens and other poultry.
I still have 2 jokes going around in my head. What did the
You have
buffalo?
2 jokes?
What What did the buffalo say to his kid as he left for school? Bison.
Yeah.
Bison.
That's funny.
No, it isn't. Quit encouraging her.
She's reaching. She's reaching.
You should have heard my
Cat that quick.
sheep one actually wasn't as good as the bison though.
I heard sheep one.
You heard the sheep one?
Yes.
Why don't sheep stray away from the herd? They know it's a bad idea.
Yes. I heard that.
I have a duck one too.
You have so many.
You heard my duck one already.
Stop it, you're quacking me up.
What did the duck say when he bought the lipstick? Put it on my bill.
All right. So moving on to chickens and other poultry. Again, I have quite a few questions from chickens and poultry because like the major livestock species are cattle, swine, and poultry. They're kind of the top three that you tend to think about. So on this introduction slide, the biology of poultry species has very unique features from cattle and pigs, obviously. So know some of these and what they are, and be able to tell me some key differences, key features that poultry have that other species don't, because they are very different. Kind of be familiar with this terminology. So pullet is a young hen, rooster obviously is an adult male, capone is a castrated chicken. So just kind of being familiar with those. I'm not going to ask about domestication. So this slide, as far as external anatomy, we talked about the secondary sex characteristics, and that's a good way to distinguish males from females. And in chickens, it's fairly easy because the rooster has a lot of things that the females, the hens, don't. So some of these secondary sex characteristics are the comb, the wattle, and spurs. And then the roosters really have really long tail feathers. So be familiar with some of the different secondary sex characteristics and how you would be able to distinguish a rooster from a hen. So just kind of a little thing there. So broiler breeders are the parent stock for the production of meat chickens. That's the term that's typically used for those. And then reproductively with chickens, we learn this term photostimulation. So that means that they will become reproductively mature when they're exposed to the day light. So being exposed to that daylight really stimulates them, photostimulation, to become reproductively mature. So be familiar with that term for chicken. And so then another thing for poultry production, artificial insemination is used widely. And then another thing is that a healthy hen will lay an egg every 24 to 27 hours, regardless of if she's mated with a rooster. So the key there is that they do not need to have mated with a rooster to produce an egg. They will produce an egg regardless. So that's kind of a common misconception that people make there. So they will have an egg produced whether a rooster has been there or not. And then caponization is the removal of the testes or castration of a male chicken. That's why they're called capones. So just kind of be somewhat familiar with that and that's what that means. As far as the digestive system, know that they're monogastrics. Methionine is an important amino acid needed for feather production, but mainly know that they're monogastrics and that corn is a major feed ingredient, just like in pigs. Pigs are typically fed corn soybean diets, and that's fairly similar with poultry as well. So know that corn and soybean are major ingredients in livestock feed for those two. So genetic selection in birds has led to improved growth rate, number of eggs produced, and better feed efficiency. So obviously those are the things you're selecting for, so you would hope your selection has led to those things. So just be familiar with those because that's how the industry continues to improve. I'm not going to ask you specifics about the different breeds. One key thing that we talked about with poultry is that poultry production is vertically integrated. And so that just means that the combination in one company of 2 or more stages of production. They pretty much own several things from the breeding stock all the way to the slaughterhouse. So be familiar with that term. It's vertical integration, vertically integrated, same thing. So know what that means. It's common in poultry, and pork production is actually really heading that way as well. So that's a term that's commonly used in the industry that you'll hear a lot if you stay in animal science. So the production of poultry meat and eggs is increasing. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of poultry meat. So we talked a little bit about litter that poultry is raised on, chickens and turkeys. So they're raised on deep litter, and the reason that they're raised on deep litter is to aid bird health, and that's by absorbing water that's spilled from waterers and from the excreta. So you don't want them like walking around on a really wet litter or anything like that, because then that's just gonna like be a breeding ground for bacteria. So the deep litter is really important for like those reasons. So be familiar with why deep litter is used in poultry. So then poultry processing, we talked about, but we didn't really talk about any really key concepts. They're just transported to a processing facility. And obviously there can be no visible contamination of the carcass. The majority of eggs produced in the U.S. are from birds in cages. Eggs collected automatically. Again, hens will produce eggs whether they have mated with a rooster or not. Talked a little bit about ducks and geese, but not too much. And then transgenic chickens. You don't really need to know anything specifically about transgenic chickens, but again, be familiar with the term transgenic animal and what that means. And then I don't think that we have anything key on that side. Any questions about chickens and other poultry? The last thing that we talked about was aquaculture. So we didn't talk about aquaculture as much as some of the other species, but there are a couple key things with aquaculture that I'd like to point out. Aquaculture species are categorized as either finfish or shellfish. It includes production of lots of different species. Let's see. That's a little bit about domestication, so I'm not going to really ask too much. We pretty much know that everything happened in the Fertile Crescent. So for aquaculture, the need for aquaculture is due to growing consumer demand and problem of overfishing. So those are kind of the two main reasons that aquaculture is really a production system today. It's because more consumer demand for fish and problem of overfishing in natural sources of fish. So carp are the #1 group of species that are raised by aquaculture. I'm not going to ask you how much it makes annually. There are opportunities for it to grow. So for fish nutrition, we talked about that not all fish species have every digestive component. So there's a lot of variability there with fish. But they do require high quality feed with very easily digestible protein. That's a very key thing for fish nutrition, because if you look, their digestive system, like we talked about earlier, is extremely short. And so that feed is going to go through pretty quickly. So they need very high quality feed with easily digestible proteins so that they can really get all of the nutrients they can. So that's what makes them really, really efficient. When they're fed a really good feed, they're very efficient as far as converting that feed to game. So reproduction, again, it varies depending on the type and species of fish. So no major classification there. Some lay eggs, some have live young, very variable. A cool thing that we really discussed with aquaculture is that some fish are hermaphrodites. And hermaphrodite can happen in any species. It's not just specific to fish, it's just that it's kind of more commonly seen in fish. But it's a term that can apply to any species that has, or animal that has both male and female sex organs and characteristics. and so they can produce sperm and eggs. So be familiar with that term and what that means, because that's kind of a neat thing, and it's really, it can be really, really important for fish, like we talked about the sequential hermaphrodites. So it's really just a good term to be familiar with. So as far as health benefits of consuming fish, omega-3 fatty acids are what we talked about that are really, really important, and they're really good for health because they cut risk of heart attack and stroke. And then, so that's the main like health benefit. And then a risk of consuming fish is that they do contain high levels of mercury. Some of them do, not all of them. But mercury can harm the nervous system, so especially pregnant women should avoid it. So mercury is a bad thing with some fish. I'm not going to ask you about the specific levels. There can be problems with infectious disease. There are a few drugs. Talked a little bit about catfish. I'm not going to ask you specifics about the breeds. And then just selection of genetics has been used to develop the aquaculture species with improved growth and other performance traits. So kind of similar to the other species. So any questions on aquaculture? Any questions about the exam, or did everybody see my announcement about the discussion board? Okay, good. If you didn't see it, go back and read it because there's a chance for you to earn 2 extra credit points before the exam even started. So if you participate in the exam 2 review discussion board that I have, which is just there for your benefit, then you'll get 2 extra credit points if you answer one of the questions that I'm putting up there. This will really help you study. A lot of the questions in that discussion board you're probably going to see on the exam. And so some students have already posted answers there. And then I kind of posted, correct or good job or whatever, so you know that answer that's there is what's correct. So definitely as you're studying, check out that review board. And if you want 2 points before the exam starts, then answer some of those questions or one of those questions. Do I have any other questions, comments? Also, just a quick announcement for the online students that will watch this once it's posted. If for some reason your proctor information has changed, please let me know so that I can make sure that the right person has the password and you go take your exam. But other than that, that's all of the announcements that I have. All right, have a good day and good luck studying, and email me if you have any questions.
Okay.